Montana Flathead Valley, late October 1947. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself with snow, it announces itself with sound. Nails pinging in porch boards at dawn. A thin crust of ice that forms and disappears before noon. Wind coming off the Whitefish Range like it has a long memory. That was when the best builder in the county walked up. Raymond Caldwell's clearing stared at the half-arch of corrugated steel lying on its side and said calm as a verdict he'd never seen a dumber shelter in 30 years. It looked like a barrel cut lengthwise, a tin tunnel, a culvert with a door, and Raymond kept bolting ribs into the ground as if the valley's opinion weighed less than the coming winter. Word traveled the way it always does out there through the diner's coffee steam, across church steps, and between men who pretended they weren't curious. A war veteran had come home and built himself a metal can to sleep in. Some laughed because laughter is cheaper than admitting fear. Others felt a real kind of pity, the kind reserved for a man you expect to find frozen before New Year's. Raymond heard it all and didn't answer. He kept working because he wasn't building for pride. He was building for January, and he left a promise hanging in the air, the kind that makes skeptics quiet later. When the real cold hits, there will be a number written down, measured twice, that tells you who was right. If you want one survival-built idea each week that people actually used when comfort wasn't guaranteed, subscribe. And tell us where you're watching from, because winter doesn't feel the same everywhere. Raymond Caldwell came back in spring with a duffel bag, a small pension, and a plan to live far enough from town that no one could borrow his saw or his opinions. 3 years as a construction engineer in the Aleutians had taught him a simple lesson. Wind doesn't care how beautiful your building looks. It only cares where it can steal heat. He'd seen steel buildings survive gales that peeled roofs like paper, but only when the air inside was controlled, when moisture had a path out, and when the heat had somewhere to stay. Back home he saw the old Montana pattern again, proud log cabins that looked right and bled warmth all winter long. Men feeding fireplaces like hungry animals, families living in their coats indoors, 8 cords of wood stacked like a fence against death. Raymond didn't have money to waste on a tradition that leaked. He bought 20 acres 4 miles from the nearest neighbor, close enough to hear a distant chainsaw on a still day, far enough that no one would come by just to check. The land sat on clay hardpan cold ground that held its temperature like a secret. Raymond walked it with a notebook the way other men carried a rifle. He marked wind direction, sun angle, where snow drifted deepest. Then in June, a flatbed truck rattled up his track carrying the thing that would start the whole valley, talking a surplus Quonset hut frame, 20 feet long, 13 wide at the base. Curved ribs, corrugated skin, military hardware, stamped and tired. Most folks assumed it was a shed for tools. Then someone heard he meant to sleep in it. That's when concern turned into mockery, because metal and Montana were not supposed to mix. The respected builder Marcus Hendren arrived uninvited, the way authority sometimes does. He walked the ribs, rapped the steel with his knuckles, listened like he could hear failure through sound. Tin turns your warmth into somebody else's weather, he said. First hard frost, you'll be living inside an icebox. Raymond didn't argue loud. He pointed to the layers staged nearby, salvaged cork sheets from an old ice house, cedar shakes stacked like shingles rolls of tar paper bags of clay. Hendren waved it away. Insulation doesn't matter when the whole shell is metal, he said. Then he noticed the stove plan, small, central, nothing like a stone fireplace, and his face tightened with something close to anger. A real cabin needs a real hearth, he said. Not a toy. Raymond let the judgment pass over him like wind over grass. He was not trying to win an argument. He was trying to win a season. He started with the ground, because winter doesn't only come through walls, it climbs up from below. He dug 18 inches down into the clay and poured a slab, not thick but deliberate. Before it cured, he set smooth river stones into the surface thermal mass that could drink heat and hold it. Then he bermed earth up the sides of the hut 3 feet high, packing it tight, shaping it so meltwater would run away instead of pooling and freezing. Earth was not pretty. Earth was steady. It kept the base from seeing the full swing of outside temperature, and it blocked the wind from stripping heat at floor level where people actually lived. On the ribs, he laid cork 2 inches of it because cork is stubborn against heat loss and doesn't mind moisture the way some fibers do. Over that, he built a second skin cedar shakes, overlapping like fish scales, the kind of cladding that sheds water and breaks the wind's bite. From a distance, it looked wrong industrial bones wearing a woodland coat. Some said it looked like a beaver lodge made by a man with a drafting table. Raymond took that as a compliment. Inside, he framed a simple liner wall where needed, leaving an air gap in places on purpose, not for mystery, for dead air. Still air is insulation you don't have to buy if you can keep it from moving. The curve helped there. No corners for cold to settle into, and no flat face for the wind to punch. He oriented 4 small windows to the south, set low enough to catch weak winter sun, high enough to keep drifting snow from sealing them shut. He built a short vestibule and airlock because most cabins lose their warmth every time the door opens like a mouth in a storm. Inside, he kept the heated volume honest. No sprawling rooms to warm just because. A sleeping loft at one end hung from ribs, putting his bed into the warmest layer of air without needing more fuel. Storage ran along the walls where the ceiling dipped, using the space that traditional cabins wasted. Then he placed the stove in the center where the geometry would push heat into a gentle loop. Hendren's people called it foolish. Raymond called it controlled. The stove was not a fireplace. It was a compact high-draft heater built from fire brick and clay, a J-shaped burn tunnel that forced the fire to burn hot and clean instead of lazy and smoky. The idea was simple. If you burn wood at higher temperatures, you burn more of the smoke too, and smoke is just unspent fuel leaving your home. Raymond fed it split-larch dry-light, honest wood, and routed the exhaust through a long bench packed with river rock before it ever saw a chimney. That bench was his battery. It absorbed heat fast during a short burn, then released it slow for hours. Not magic, physics, convection controlled by shape, conduction slowed by insulation, radiant heat stored in mass instead of thrown away up a flue. By August, the shell was tight. By September, the valley had decided what the story meant. A veteran came home thinking war tricks could outsmart Montana. The mockery wasn't only about heat, it was about belonging. Log cabins were identity earned by felling trees, cutting notches, stacking history by hand. A Quonset shape felt like a factory had wandered into the forest. At the Grange Hall meeting in November, Hendren made it official. He stood up in front of neighbors and said he couldn't watch a man die from stubborn pride. He offered Raymond a backup cabin, a proper shelter with a real hearth. Heads nodded. Raymond listened, stood slowly, and thanked them for the concern. Then he said quietly he would stay in his build. Winter would decide. October ended with the first real snow. Not deep, just enough to make the world look sealed. People stopped talking about Raymond because they had their own work, chinking cracks, stacking wood, hauling supplies before roads turned to white trenches. In cabins across the valley, fireplaces were tested, flues cleaned, axes sharpened. Raymond did his own rituals. He sealed vents where he needed to and opened others on purpose. Because a warm shelter that can't breathe becomes a wet shelter, and wet is how cold gets inside without asking. He kept a ledger wood brought in wood-burned burn times, and he kept 2 thermometers that agreed with each other, because proof means nothing if someone can say your tool was wrong. Early January 1948 arrived mild enough to make people careless. Teens in the day, single digits at night. That's when most cabins are at their best, when the fire feels sufficient and the corners only bite a little. Raymond's hut held steady. 2 short burns a day, morning and evening, and the stone bench stayed warm like a sleeping animal. The slab underfoot never felt friendly, but it stopped feeling cruel. He slept in the loft and woke to a room that had not collapsed into ice while he dreamed. He used less wood than his nearest neighbor used in a week, and he wrote it down because memory lies when you're tired. Then the sky changed. A pale, hard color, the kind you see before the world goes quiet and dangerous. The cold front came out of Alberta like a door opening on something that should have stayed shut. Noon was 8 above. Sunset was below 0. Midnight was a number men don't like to say in front of their children. Then the wind arrived, not gusty, not playful, steady pressure from the north that hunted seams and punished mistakes. In log cabins, it came up through floor gaps and around window frames, turning candle flames sideways. In Raymond's clearing, the wind met a curve and slid. It couldn't grab a corner because there were none. It couldn't slam into a broad wall because the shell offered it no flat target. Raymond woke before dawn and checked the gauge inside his door. The needle held in the 50s without fresh fuel because the bench was giving back what it had stored. Outside, the air was racing toward 40 below. By morning, the official reading in town hovered near -40, and with wind, it felt like the world had become a freezer with teeth. This was the kind of cold that makes metal brittle and breath sting like smoke. Across the valley, families tightened routines. Children were told not to wander far. Men fed fires before the coffee finished brewing. Frank Peterson, Raymond's nearest neighbor, had a classic log cabin with a proud stone fireplace, and he was doing everything right. By tradition, big firebox, thick logs, tight chinking. Still, his corners went cold. Floor-level air turned sharp. The fire ate wood as if insulted by the weather, and even then, the thermometer wouldn't climb past the low 50s. His kids slept in layers, coats folded under their heads like extra hope. In Raymond's hut, the air stayed even, no frozen corners, no knife-edged drafts, just steady warmth moving in a slow loop. On the 3rd day of the snap, an old trapper named Douglas Mackey decided to check on Raymond, not because he liked the man, but because the valley had a code. You don't let stubborn become a death notice if you can help it. He snowshoed 4 miles through wind that scraped exposed skin raw. When he reached the clearing, he expected a silent structure and a problem. Instead, he saw a thin thread of smoke from a small chimney barely there, the way efficient fires look. He knocked. Raymond opened the door in shirt sleeves. Warm air rolled out not as a blast, but as a calm presence. Mackey stepped inside and stopped like a man who had walked into the wrong season. Raymond pointed at the thermometer. Mid-60s. Outside was still deep below 0. Mackey stared at the small stove and then at the bench radiating heat like sun-warmed rock. He didn't laugh. He just sat down and let the warmth sink into him the way tired men do when they realize they might survive after all. "Bring Hendren," Mackey said finally, voice low, as if speaking too loud would break the moment. Raymond didn't smile. "He won't believe me," he said. "He'll believe the tools," Mackey replied. By the next morning, Hendren came with 2 other builders and 3 thermometers because pride needs witnesses when it's about to change. They marched in like men entering a courtroom ready to prove a foolish experiment was failing. Raymond welcomed them without apology. They hung their instruments in different places, door center near the wall where they expected cold to hide. Each one settled on the same truth: the room was warm and even. Outside, the air cut like glass. Hendren walked slowly, touching the wall, checking seams, looking for a trick. There was none. Just layers, air gaps, mass, and a stove that burned clean. He crouched near the bench and felt heat hours after the last feed. The room made him quiet in a way laughter never could. Then Raymond showed them the ledger. Not stories, not opinions. Hours of burn time, pieces of wood counted and stacked. He wasn't burning all day, he was burning short and hot, charging the stone like a battery. Hendren asked the question every builder asks when their worldview is threatened. How Raymond answered with a handful of simple rules. First, block wind before it touches your warm surfaces. Earth berm does that. Second, stop air from moving through your walls. Dead air is your friend when it's trapped. Third, store heat in mass, so the room doesn't crash when the fire slows. Fourth, keep the chimney from stealing your life, because an open fireplace often sends more warm air outside than it gives back. Fifth, shrink the problem. Heat the space you live in, not the space your pride wants. Hendren listened. He didn't like it, but winter doesn't ask what you like. On the coldest night, when the valley dipped toward the worst number anyone had seen in years, Mackey suggested they do what would end the argument for good. They would measure several cabins in the same window of time and write the results down with names attached. Not to shame people. To stop guessing. They went to Frank Peterson's place first. The fire roared. The room by the hearth felt almost pleasant, but the measurements told a different story. Floor-level air in the corners far below, comfort drafts sneaking under the door temperature, swinging hard whenever the fire's appetite slowed. They went to Hendren's cabin next, better built than most, tighter, chinking, more care, and still it demanded constant feeding to hold the high 50s. Then they returned to Raymond's Quonset and watched it keep the mid-60s with less fuel and fewer spikes. When the smoke cleared, the number that made the room go still wasn't a speech. It was a simple difference written in a notebook, 67 degrees warmer than the air outside and warmer than every cabin they'd tested that night while burning a fraction of the wood. The valley didn't become a science lab overnight. It became something older, practical. Men who had laughed came to just take a look. Women who had slept with their children in layers came to feel that steady warmth for themselves. The most convincing proof wasn't only the thermometer, it was the way life changed inside those walls. In Raymond's hut, you could set a cup down and not watch it frost at the rim. You could read without hunching near the fire. You could sleep through the night without waking to feed flames like a starving animal. And wood, precious, heavy, time-consuming wood, stopped being the main character in every winter day. Hendren didn't make excuses. On his third visit, he admitted in front of witnesses that he had been wrong about what metal meant when it was wrapped, buffered, and paired with mass. "I built what I was taught," he said. "It worked well enough that I stopped asking if it could work better." Then he did something rare. He apologized. Spring arrived late, but it arrived. When roads softened and the valley breathed again, the copying began, not loud, not proud, just steady. A young couple in Eureka built a modified arch with wood siding, so it looked more right to their neighbors. A ranch hand added a heat bench to his existing cabin and cut his wood use noticeably. Someone else built a small vestibule on a log cabin and stopped losing warmth every time the door opened. The best ideas don't spread because they're fashionable. They spread because they rescue people from exhaustion. And that was the real legacy of Raymond Caldwell, not a strange-looking shelter, but a reminder that frontier life only rewards what works. Tradition can keep you alive, but winter doesn't care about tradition. It cares about physics, planning, and the humility to measure the truth. Which part of this would you steal for your own place? An airlock, more mass, a smaller heated volume, or a cleaner burn? Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you've lived through felt like. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. Educational note. This story is a dramatized reconstruction inspired by historical cold climate building practices and real physical principles: air sealing, insulation, thermal mass, and efficient combustion. If you build or modify a heating system or structure today, follow current safety standards, building codes, and local regulations. This is educational storytelling, not professional engineering or legal advice.